maybe I'm not saying anything too controversial here. I think it's gotten sort of dumbed down, right? Because if you actually think of original pumpkin pie spice blends, it derives from, or I should say, I imagine it derives from a lot of the baking spices coming from Eastern and Northern Europe, and they would have a lot of black pepper in them. So now imagine cinnamon, clove, allspice with a lot of ginger and a lot of black pepper. And that's something I'm interested in. I want that cookie. I don't want one without the black pepper and really old stale ginger. So contrast is the key to building a spice blend. And now we're going to practice. Okay, so let's look at this chart, have contrast in mind, and then we're going to crowdsource one practice spice blend, and then we're going to make the real deal while we make our chickpeas. Okay, so this spice blend, again, this is really basic, and some of my favorite spices aren't on here, like sumac, right? So these are just big introductory categories. We have herbal menthol, which is mostly dried herbs, but also cardamom and fennel. So it's anything that has a cooling sensation. It sort of lifts up your food. Maybe it's a little minty, a little piney, a little woodsy. Then you have fiery spicy, and that's what we would expect. It's the chili peppers, the chili flakes, but it's also black pepper. And if you have great dried ginger, it can be dried ginger, right? So again, these are big buckets and everything's actually a continuum. Then we have pungent grounding, and that's cumin, coriander. These are savory. They hardly have anything sweet in them. If you think in terms of music, they're bass notes, right? They're holding up the foundation of something. And then you would contrast it with something fiery or something herbal. And a lot of my favorite spices happen to be in the pungent grounding category. And then you have the warming spices. These are things that like maybe you think make you feel cozy, they feel like baking, but I encourage you to use them in savory applications. So a little bit of allspice, a little bit of cinnamon with chili flakes, with cumin can make your food have an immense depth of flavor, especially in the winter months. So again, not all spices are on here within the categories, and not all flavors or types of spices are on here. Like I said, sumac, which is a very tart flavor. But we can start here and have a lot of fun, and you can use this knowledge to get curious about more and more spices. Okay, so the rules for building an intro spice blend are simple. Keep contrast in mind, all right? There's no wiggle room on these rules though. They are, you use 3 spices, not 2, not 1, not 4, 3 spices, and they can come from only 2 categories. What that does is you have 2 spices from one category. That's your foundation. That's sort of the point of view that makes sure that your blend has clarity and doesn't feel like everything in the kitchen sink thrown into a jar. And then you have a 3rd spice, which provides that contrast we were talking about. So I have the chat up. So let's practice. You ready? This is how it's going to go. You're going to put in the chat a spice following my cue. And the first spice I see is going to be the spice that I use. So the first person to name any spice on this chart, any of them, go for it. Cumin, great. I love cumin. You set me up for success. Okay, second person to name any other spice on the chart. Doesn't matter. What did I see first? I saw caraway first. Cumin and caraway. Ooh, caraway is like an unsung hero of the spice cabinet. It is a gorgeous spice. It's great in biscuits, in case you're wondering. Okay, so now we have 2 spices from the pungent grounding category. So now we need a 3rd spice. It cannot come from that category. So first one, go now. Someone to throw something in. Ginger. Oh, no, tarragon is first. I have to play by my rules. If I'm going to make you play the rules, I can play by the rules. Tarragon, that is super interesting because tarragon and caraway have a little bit of a licorice flavor to them. So that's a fun thing to consider when we think about proportions. So we have cumin, caraway, and tarragon. And I'm thinking white bean salad, white fleshed firm fish. I want to throw some fresh dill in on the end and some lemon. I also think it'd be fantastic on roast chicken because most things are fantastic on roast chicken. Okay, so knowing that we have 2 spices though that have a little bit of that licoricey flavor, we may not want to overdo it on those because it's already going to be pronounced. So if we were to make a 2-teaspoon blend, which we'll do later, I would do a full teaspoon of cumin because that's the savory smoky, which is an awesome contrast with the licorice flavor. So a full teaspoon of cumin, and then I would do a 1/2 teaspoon each of tarragon and caraway. And that would be an absolutely beautiful spice blend. And if anyone else has ideas for how they would use it, please throw them in the chat. But I'm really thinking like a white bean salad, some sort of warm white bean salad, maybe where you crush the beans a little and they get a little crispy and fried. And then you make a hot oil with that spice blend. And maybe the spices are whole for textural contrast. And then some lemon and some dill, and I'd be in heaven. All right. But that's not our signature spice blend. We will get back to our signature spice blend. We're going to have to build it in a second. Hummus. Yeah, I would totally put it on hummus and roasted cod. Those are great suggestions. I love it. You guys are awesome. You're very interactive and I can tell this is a bunch of cooks. It's going to be a lot of fun. I wish we were doing this in person. Okay. So let me stop sharing my screen and first see, do we have any general spice cooking questions that are coming up? We can take a minute to answer them. I just mentioned something about whole versus ground. Is anyone interested in a slight aside on when to use whole spices and when to use ground spices? Throw it in the chat if you're interested. Cindy, yes. Okay, great. Let me also get this out. My mortar and pestle, because this is my best friend for making these decisions. So the general rule that we use, or that I think about when I'm cooking, is I use ground spices when I want that flavor to be evenly distributed throughout a whole dish and it becomes part of the background. So if I'm making a big platter of roasted butternut squash and I want them to feel spiced, right, but warm, and I know I'm going to use other things for contrast later, maybe some really cold, thick yogurt with some tahini mixed in, or I'm going to use a lot of fresh herbs later, or I'm going to use an awesome chili sauce later. And I just want the background to be spiced. I'm going to use ground spices because every bite's going to have the same quantity and the same texture. When you change texture and you change quantity, then something no longer is the foundation of a dish. It's something, it sort of punctuates, right? It's an accent. So I use whole or coarsely ground spices when I want when I'm eating, I want to remember and think about that particular flavor. So a coarsely ground fennel seed, one bite will have it and another bite won't. And when that bite has it, I say, oh, awesome, fennel. So that's my rule of thumb. As for coarsely ground, I like to do it in a mortar and pestle. Because sometimes a whole seed, especially coriander or cardamom, can be unpleasant to bite down on. But if you just bruise it and crush it, you get enough texture that it's not finely ground. So you can still punctuate the dish, but it's more palatable. It's also a great way, coarsely ground spices are also a great way to get a rub on a steak or chicken instead of using our pork chop. Instead of using ground spices, when you use coarse spices, they're ground up enough to stick, which is important, but you get a little more of a thick crust. You get that textural crunch of biting through the spices with your teeth on the char of the outside of that awesome steak. And the inside is such a big contrast then. So I think that's fun. Are there any spices that add umami flavor? Yeah, Bill, some. So if there are fermented, and some dried chilies are actually fermented in the drying process. So some of those will. Tomatoes, if you use ground tomato, you can get sun-dried tomato powder. That is a great way. You can also get mushroom powder. So those are a great way to add umami. For those of you who don't know, umami is savoriness. It's one of our 5 identified tastes on our tongue, and we identify it as savoriness. So it's a really good way to add depth to a dish. So the ground mushroom powder, ground sun-dried tomato powder, those are great ways to get a big punch of savoriness for sure. So that was just my little aside. Let's build our spice blend, and then we're going to cook from start to finish. Okay. So let me throw up the chart again, just so we have a little basis. So this is it. This is the WHYY custom spice blend. This is like training wheels are off. This is the real deal. Same rules, 3 spices from 2 categories. And say, we're going to do it the same way. First spice that someone names that I have in my kitchen. Let me see. Oops, the chat. Nutmeg. I don't have ancho. I do have ancho. Okay, so we're going to use ancho. I'm sorry, I don't have nutmeg ground, and you don't want to watch me grind nutmeg. It's going to take too much. Okay, so we have ancho. Awesome. So that's sort of like that chocolatey, not too spicy, dark dried red berry flavor. All right, so now we need, that's from the fiery spicy. So now we need any other spice. Go for it. I see ginger up there. So let's do, but mint came, actually following the rules, the new one, mint came. So we're gonna do mint. This is cool. This is really, really, really cool. So we have fiery spicy and we have herbal menthol, mint and ancho. So the third spice has to come from one of those 2 categories. Go. The next person to put rosemary. Oh, that's great. Do I have rosemary? Hold on. Let me look. Hold on, let me check my cabinet. Where in luck? I have a little. All right, cool. So we have dried mint, we have ancho chili pepper, and we have rosemary. Okay, so ancho's not super spicy. This is cool because we can actually, sometimes when you choose a chili, you can't use too much of it. Cayenne's really spicy. There's some other ones that are really spicy. It's nice to have a chili that we can actually play up the flavor. So dried chilies are so much more than a source of spice, right? They have these amazing flavors, which I've been trying to share with you when I talk about ancho being chocolatey and those dried red berry flavors, not just, oh, that's spicy. There's so much more to dried chilies. So we need 2 teaspoons, and I'm just going to do something similar to the last one because we have 2 spices from the same category. We have mint and rosemary. God, the rosemary is genius. Whoever put that in, that's great. We're going to do a full teaspoon of ancho. We're not going to hold back. And then we're going to do half and half of rosemary and mint, dried mint. Dried mint is one of my favorite dried herbs. Dried mint and dried Mexican oregano are probably my 2 favorite dried herbs because I think they maintain a very complex flavor when they are dried. They don't get sort of musty and dusty. And dried mint with sumac on tomatoes in the summer is gorgeous.
Oh, Rosie, real quick, while we're at this point, we have a question in the chat that says, so by definition, spices are all dried, ? Fresh thyme, rosemary, etc. are considered herbs?
Great question. So when things are dried, I consider them spices. They are spices. When they're fresh, they're either fresh herbs or aromatics. So ginger is a good example. Fresh ginger is an aromatic. It's something you saute down. It's got full of water. It's juicy. It's got a different flavor. When you dry it, it's a spice. So yes, all spices in culinary, they have a fresh version of themselves, but spices are the dried parts of plants. I hope that helps. Okay. And please interrupt me if there are more questions. So this was our teaspoon of ancho, half a teaspoon of rosemary and mint dried, half a teaspoon of salt and a 1/4 teaspoon of sugar. Remember that was there before. Now spices burn super, super quickly, especially ground spices. So I'm going to set this to the side. We are not going to use this until the very end when the chickpeas are crispy and fried. And we'll use the residual heat from the pan too. Does anyone remember the word Josh used when he made that Aleppo pepper chili oil? He said that that technique is called what? Anyone remembers? Let me know. Blooming. Betty, awesome. Yes. So we will bloom them in the residual heat. So to get started, we want to put our 2 tablespoons of cornstarch right onto our chickpeas and toss that around. And you know what? My hands are clean. These are your best tools. You want them to look like little snowballs, and you do it in a sieve because you don't want any of the leftover cornstarch will actually make it gummy if there's too much. So you do want to make sure that you sieve it down. And this is going to help with browning. It's also going to help wick away some extra moisture so that things crisp up quickly. And then I'm just going to move my camera over so it's between the pan and the bowl now. How's that? Great. And now we're going to turn our pan on to medium high. And we're going to add our 1/4 cup of oil. Again, any oil you want. For this one, you could use easily olive oil. You could also use, it would be great with butter and on popcorn. This blend would be amazing on popcorn. I may have to do that later tonight. So this is on medium high, and we're not going to add the chickpeas till this oil is nice and hot. And that's because, as a lot of you know, since you're all such good cooks, is that browning doesn't happen until the surface of the food you're trying to brown is 300 degrees and above, or I should say, doesn't happen quickly. There are other contexts it can happen under, but we're not going deep into science here. Water turns into steam at 212, and there is some water in the chickpea. So the hotter the pan is, the quicker the outsides will brown before the water on the inside sort of comes to the surface and slows the process down. I do want to say, if you're cooking along, these can get a little frisky and they can pop out of the pan. So use a splatter guard. I'm not going to so you can see everything, but a splatter guard will prevent them from popping up out of the pan. You just want to, because there is moisture in these chickpeas, right? Sure, Trisha, it's a teaspoon of ancho, and it's a 1/2 teaspoon each of the mint and the rosemary, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of sugar. So while this warms up, it's good to remember that ground spices burn a lot faster than whole spices. And if a recipe says like bloom onions, right, or soften onions, and then you put in spices, that's okay, because the water from the onions or whatever other aromatics are in there cools down the pan and also protects the spices. So you actually can have spices cooking for quite a long time, but not on their own. They need something that's keeping them cool. That's why a lot of recipes start with the onions and then you add spices later. Another way to do that, a very amazing and traditional technique in different parts of India is called a tadka. And that is when you actually make your dish, you make a pretty simple, say dal, which is lentils. And at the end, in a separate skillet, you heat oil and your spices and maybe some fresh aromatics, and you pour it on at the end. So you've captured all of the volatile aromas. So you get the maximum amount of flavor, and you also have control over nothing burning during the cooking process. It's also the reason why I like to start all of my spices in cool heat or residual heat, like we're going to do today. So if I'm going to toast spices, or sorry, bloom spices, I put them, even if a recipe does not say this, I put them into cool oil and heat them at the same time so they can come up slowly. What that does, as opposed to putting spices into really hot oil where they can burn quickly, is you have more time for the spices to infuse the fat as it heats up with a more nuanced flavor. Okay, so let's see if our pan is hot. I'm just gonna throw a few chickpeas in. I'm gonna turn it up a little. I want it to really sizzle. You want these to brown quickly, more contrast, right? We want the outside to be crispy brown and charred a little bit and have a nice sort of dried texture, that crispy texture, and then the inside has that beautiful, lush, soft, hot chickpea texture. So you really do want them to burn quickly so that the inside doesn't dry out. So into the pan they go, and we're just going to stir them around in the oil, put them in a single layer, and let them brown. We're not going to touch them much. And then I'm turning my pan, I turned it up a little, I'm turning it back down to medium high. Because again, I don't want the outsides to burn. I want to give them time to everything to heat through and to get a really beautiful crust on them. All right, so while that hangs out over there, I'm using canned chickpeas, Joel, but you can use chickpeas you cooked from dry. It's 1.5 cups for this recipe. I'd love to know if there are any other questions about spices, particular spices, how to use them, how to store spices, how to source spices. I'd love to answer a few questions while we wait for these guys to brown up. Kae Lani, have you gotten any, or are there any the students want to throw in the chat now?
Sorry, I think I was muted for a moment. Sorry. While I wait for some questions to kind of come in, are there any places where you like to source your spices? Are you buying any spices online or?
Yeah, I think a great thing that's happening recently is a lot of attention to sourcing spices and a number of companies that are US based that are working directly with the spice farmers. So you're getting extremely high quality spices from a single location, either a single farm or a single area. And so I'm looking to those companies, either a company like Burlap and Barrel that's getting a diversity of spices, but doing a really good job of sourcing them. Diaspora and Company out of Oakland, I believe, but they're just working with right now Indian farmers. So I like that. I just think you can get so much flavor out of such a small ingredient that it's a very good use of money. They do cost more because they're sourced in a very different way than big than companies that use a middle person. But I find that it's a great value. The impact of just a 1/4 teaspoon of these spices is incredible. When I'm not sourcing spices that way, I do try and buy them from maybe a place like Penzeys where I can get small amounts or large amounts so that I don't, if I'm trying a new spice, I don't worry about getting a spice that I'm not sure how to use. I can just get a little bit. Same if you live in a place that has a great bulk section that you know is turned over quickly. And then I also just love, I'm in Boston. I'm lucky to be in a place where there are different neighborhoods with shops run by people who they themselves immigrated or their families, they're a couple generations in the United States. And I just love going in there and asking advice, saying, what spices do you love? And do you mind? Do you have time? They may be busy because they're store owners. Do you have time to suggest a few ways to use something? Because I'm always exploring new flavors.
Excellent recommendations. I actually just got a lot of unique salt blends from Burlap and Barrel, and I absolutely love them. And also I love the idea that you can get the essence of salt from other components like their sun-dried tomato powder, and and then they have the Icelandic kelp as well.
That's another great place to get umami from for our previous student.
Oh, yes. And so there's some people that were asking, with Philadelphia specifically, there's a Penzeys between 2nd and 3rd on Market Street. Another really great shop to check out. Oh, I had it in my notes. Another great shop to check out is in West Philly, there's a place called International Foods and Spices, and they specialize in Indian and South Asian staples and spices. And they're a great place, great group of people to talk to. The urban area in Reading Terminal Market as well. But aside from all the specific places in Philadelphia to get spices, people are asking, what's the best way to store their spices? Are you using plastic or tin containers or glass? What are you using?
The two things you need to remember are heat and light degrade spices cause them to degrade more quickly. So a lot of their aromas are volatile. That's another reason to get whole spices and grind them yourself if you can, is because more surface area on ground spices, they'll lose their flavor more quickly. But no, as long as they're out of heat and they're out of light. So those spice racks above your oven, don't do that. Keep them in the dark and keep them cool. The freezer is a great place to keep spices that you buy a large quantity of and you're not going to use quickly. I also saw a cool question in the chat about, do spices, the same spice from different regions, taste different? Yes, it's awesome. If you really get into spice tasting, you can get like coriander seeds from different countries or even different regions within the same country, and they taste really different. Coriander is a great one because some are super limey, some are really orangey, some are really lemony. So it's totally awesome. It's a great way to discover really the nuance. Of course, when I first started teaching cooking, it's like, oh, coriander's coriander. But I know that not all dahlias are dahlias look different. So of course there are different varieties of every spice too, because they're plants and nature's awesome.
Yes, there's lots of different varieties. Also, too, just like there's terroir with wine, there's terroir with other ingredients as well. Awesome. There was a question about how frequently are you going out and purchasing new, like fresh spices?
Well, my unfair answer is I have a job where I get really cool spices all the time. But in my non-working life, actually not that often. I take the time to buy smaller jars. So I'm more interested in a jar like this size than I am huge jars. And because they have so much flavor, and I actually, if you cook the same flavor profile every night, then you're going to go through them more quickly. If you are cooking cuisines, different flavor profiles a couple times a week, you're not always using cumin and coriander. Sometimes you're using cumin and ancho. You might go through that cumin quickly, but the other ones you won't. So I really think it's just a couple times a year. I'm restocking my most used spices, and the rest of the time once a year. If it's been a year, I'll throw it in the fridge if I'm not using it that often. Even if I love it, but it's just not something I cook a lot with, I'll just throw it in the freezer.
Wonderful. Now we also have a question from a Charles Maxfield who says, we got sumac and juniper berries for American Indian recipes we made at Thanksgiving. What else can we do with these?
So they're both gorgeous together. I mean, they'd be great as a fish rub. If you mix them with both of them together with some fennel fronds and some salt, it'd be amazing on pork, just amazing on the outside of pork. But also separately, sumac's also used a lot in Turkish cuisine, and in Palestinian cuisine and in Lebanese cuisine. So maybe get a cookbook from there and see how they use it. I saw an earlier question about gifts. A great way to give a gift of spices is to give them a few spices with a cookbook. So it's a guide for how to use it. And juniper, think about Scandinavia. Make gravlax, for example, would be fantastic. Distill your own gin. That would be awesome. But if you think about, and I actually like, a little juniper and white sugar together, just a little juniper strong, can sort of take the place of rosemary in a shortbread cookie. So those are just a few ideas, Charles. Kae Lani, let's look at my chickpeas because they're getting nice and golden. And there's some really great color going on here, and they're the perfect crispy texture. So I'm going to turn the heat off. So now there's no new heat coming into my skillet. So now when I add my ground spices with that little bit of sugar and salt, they're going to bloom because there's a 1/4 cup of oil in here, but it's the residual heat plus me stirring. So I'm protecting them from burning by stirring them and by not having new heat transfer into the pan. What I can say is I can already smell how amazing the aromas that are released from the fat. So the fat soluble compounds coming up to meet me. A little cooking tip I like to tell people is spices start aromatic, and often recipes say cook until aromatic. But when they start aromatic, it's hard to gauge the change. So make sure you smell your spice or spice blend before you add it to heat. Get a sense of its baseline aroma. Then once it hits heat and hits fat and those flavors, those aromas change, then you're going to know until aromatic, right? Because you're not starting with like panko, or something that's pretty neutral, a piece of bread. You're starting with something that's aromatic. So make sure you smell it before you add it to the heat. I love the color of the ancho in here. I just think it's really dramatic and elegant. I would throw these onto a big plate of roasted squash and parsnips. I think that'd be beautiful with some fresh herbs or some pomegranate seeds. I like to serve these as an appetizer sometimes. It just with they're great with a little bit of beer or whiskey or bubbles. Champagne is fantastic with these, which is a nice festive thing. They're also great mixed in with other proteins. So roasted chicken with some chickpeas. They're an awesome sub for croutons. So make a soup, and instead of croutons, you put a spicy chickpea in there. It's totally fun and great. And they're also really good just on their own, snacking them. So do we have any? So that's them. They're done. that's the recipe. We've made our spice blend, our on-show rosemary mint spice blend, the WHYY custom spice blend. Thank you all for your awesome suggestions. We've bloomed our spices. We've fried up our chickpeas, and now I'm happy to continue chatting about spices for a few minutes if we have some more questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Those look amazing. I wish I had some. I'm like bummed I didn't cook alongside of you.
Next time, we'll do it in person together next time.
Yes, I would love that. So in the chat, we have Linda Anderson, and I have a question for Linda. She's asking, is keeping herbs on your windowsill good to do during any season, specifically dill or mint? And my question to her was, are you growing the herbs on your windowsill, or are you storing the herbs on your windowsill?
That's a good, my answer will be different. So yes, Linda, I'm going to wait for the follow-up.
And then we have Joel Kessler, who's asking how we can adapt this recipe with boneless chicken breasts.
Sure. So what I would do, which is great, you can make a cutlet. So I would take the boneless, skinless chicken breast and I would slice it in half this way. So you get something thinner so it cooks quickly. That's a great way not to overcook chicken. Keep it moist in the center, but get it crispy on the outside. And then you can make a simple dredge with either all-purpose flour or cornstarch. And I'd add the spice blend to that. You don't need to do a multi-step one with egg or anything. You season the chicken with just a little salt, and then dredge it in your mixture of all-purpose flour and your spice blend of choice. And then make sure your oil is nice and hot. And then you get once the outside's brown on both sides, because they're cutlets, the inside's cooked. And it's impossible to temp cutlets because your thermometer goes straight through to the pan. But I've never made a cutlet that's undercooked. If the outside with that crust, that spice crust, gets browned, nice and golden brown, right? Not pale, but nice and golden brown. Then you've got this great, very thin, spiced, shattery crust and this moist, boneless, skinless chicken breast underneath.
Wonderful. Well, Linda says not yet in regards to the spices or the herbs on her windowsill. So, I mean, would you like to tackle both scenarios?
Sure. So growing, you need a good sunny south-facing window in the summer. In the winter this time of year, because the sun's so far to the south that you're not going to get a lot of strong light. So if you want to grow your herbs inside, some established plants like rosemary and mint or sage can make it through in their pot, but it's not so hard to get a grow light and grow things, because then you give them a much more powerful light, and you can grow a lot of herbs and just clip them as you need them throughout the winter. You can get whole setups. If you're more ambitious, I use my sister's old baby crib and I sling up big shop lights, and instead of a baby on a mattress, we have a mattress covered in starts for our garden. But throughout the winter, we can get sprouts and stuff that way. For herbs you're buying at the grocery store, sort of similar to spices, where there's two things that are their enemy. Moisture is their enemy, and air, except for parsley will keep forever in a glass with some water in it on your window. Parsley is like indestructible. Basil hates moisture, hates it. So basil needs to be protected and coddled. It needs to be in a plastic bag, covered in your fridge, maybe in a little thing of water. So it's sort of like spices. It depends on the herb, but parsley is indestructible, and really moisture is the biggest enemy. So when I buy a bunch of cilantro, I take the tag off the bottom because there's all moisture stuck where the stems are put together. I separate it out on a clean kitchen towel and I roll them so that the towel absorbs some of the moisture. I put that in a bag in the fridge, and it will last for a long time that way.
Thank you. That is some really great insight. This is one that I think a lot of us deal with. What about those old spices? They're a little bit past their prime. Is there any way that we could use them aside from throwing them away?
Totally. So what you want to do is you can either toast them in a dry skillet, and so what you do when you toast and bloom spices is you develop new flavor compounds through the application of heat in both situations, and also fat in blooming. So the heat catalyzes something called the Maillard reaction in the spices, because spices have proteins and carbohydrates in them. And so just like when you sear a steak on the outside, you get that savory new flavor. You can do that toasting spices. So you bring out new flavor, you sort of give them a little electric jolt and they come back to life. And so if you toast them and they're dry, I love that added to salad dressings, especially in the winter when you want your salad to be a little more warming. Or you could bloom them in oil and then you could drizzle it on lentil soup, on beans, onto, if you just have some poached chicken, you make a little spice oil and drizzle that on top and it sort of brings it back to life. If you do those two things and there's still no flavor, compost. If you do those things and it tastes great, great. You don't need to throw them away.
Oh, gotta love the science of spices. So speaking of the science of spices, how about the science of slow cookers? Will putting spices in your slow cooker burn them?
Yeah, so no, well, it depends what you're cooking. So like we have a Cape Malay curry from South Africa, community in South Africa, and they put whole spices untoasted in their broth of this beautiful chicken dish. And so you get, and they never toast them. They just sort of simmer in the broth and you bite into a little fennel seed. It's delicious. So you could slow cook something that way, where you put whole seeds in and you get the flavor of them that's not changed by heat, right? The liquid of your braise or whatever's in your slow cooker is not going to get hot enough to actually change their flavor. So you get that fresh, bright, raw spice flavor. It's great. Or most slow cookers, you can toast things on the bottom first. So you might have some onions going, then you throw in some spices. But then because there's so much liquid in a slow cooker, you're not going to burn them, right? You need that liquid in a slow cooker. So you're fine.
We have a question from Margot. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Yeah. How would you grind whole spices for an everyday curry blend?
Well, it really depends on where your curry blend comes from. So I'd find a cookbook from someone, who's an expert in the curry so if it's Malaysian curry, or if it's a South Indian curry, or if it's a Sri Lankan curry, a Japanese curry, they will be made differently. So if you're interested in one of those, I would find a source that's expert in them, or come to one of our cooking classes. And there will be different approaches. So one approach is you toast everything first to drive out any extra moisture, and also to catalyze that Maillard reaction to develop more toastier, warmer flavors, savory flavors. And then you can either store them whole and grind them as you need them, which is like the best, but also the most time intensive. Or once they're cool, and that's important, once they're cool, you grind them up. And like if you make curry often, you can grind up this much, and that's good for a couple months. And you only have to do that process every couple months. And then you just have to pop open a jar right before you cook and make your recipe.
That's wonderful. Going back to the chicken breast question, we have Joel who's asking, what's that ratio between when we're dredging, what's the ratio of flour to spice?
What would I do? I would probably, we're not talking about super expensive ingredients. So you don't want to skimp. It's not like, you don't want to just like dust them. You need to actually make a crust. So I would get a pie plate out, and I'd probably put a half a cup or cup of flour. If we're talking about 4 chicken cutlets, and then I'd at least a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons of the spice blend, because I want to really taste that. I want that texture. I don't want it to just be like speckled throughout. Then you don't get the crust. It's actually the spices are creating the crust as much as the flour or cornstarch are. The flour or cornstarch are actually kind of almost more like an adhesive. So I'd make sure that it was pretty well spiced, 2 tablespoons, a quarter cup. Make sure that it's really well, incorporated, and that there's plenty of spice. And then I put them in both sides, and then I do tap them off. Like, you don't want that gumminess. So I do tap them off and make sure that they don't have extra. So I'd start there. That's just off the top of my head. I usually just throw these things together, but you want a lot of spice, right? So you're using a spice blend that you're comfortable putting up to a quarter cup into your dredge, because that's really the crust.
Okay, well, for the last question of the evening, is there a gold standard for core spices that we should be stocking in our pantry?
That's a subjective answer. I love that, but that's really where this gets fun, right? So how I usually guide my students with this is I say, what are the cuisines you are drawn to cooking the most often? And figure out what spices are in that cuisine. And those are the ones. So if there are, say, 2 cuisines that during the week, that you're drawn to, right? Then make sure you always have that cuisine's core spice list on hand, because it makes it really easy to cook. without thinking about it. You may even want to make those cuisines core spice blends so that, again, it's just one bottle you're opening and not 4 or 5. So that's how I start gauging what should always be in your kitchen. And then you always want to have fun and have a few extras, right? So if there's a chili flake, you love chili, have 3 or 4. They taste really, really, really different. And so you can change, if you want a more limey chili flake, or if you want a more fruity, fresh chili flake versus that like dried ancho or smoky chipotle, but really think about what you like to eat. Think about what you're drawn to. Make it easy. Start there. Make sure you always have those on hand. And then if there's a new cuisine you want to experiment with, give yourself a month, and once a week, you're going to cook a recipe from that cuisine. You're going to get to know it. You're going to get to know those spices, and maybe you incorporate that core group as well.
Oh, I think we still have like a couple more minutes, and I do want to squeeze in there. I'm selfishly taking this question on, right? Because you seem like this is what I love about the Milk Street team, is that you're inspiring people to explore the world of cuisine in their homes, but also out in the world. And I know I've been stuck at home for the past couple of years. I have not used my passport since 2018, I think. So tell me, spices make a really great souvenir. Has there been a spice that you've picked up somewhere along your travels that you just absolutely love?
Absolutely. Aleppo pepper in Turkey. It absolutely changed my cooking. That's personal. Me picking up Aleppo pepper in Turkey was amazing. I love that pepper flake. It is an incredible pepper. So that I picked up on my travel. Someone from their own travels sent me blue turmeric, which is a gorgeous. And I actually can't remember which particular country she's in, and I don't want to misrepresent it. But blue turmeric, it's like ginger and turmeric got together and had a baby. So it's a little fiery and fruity like ginger, but it's also pungent and earthy like turmeric. I love it. It's so amazing. Just that with some leeks and some spinach cooked down, it's just like 3 and 4 ingredients and you're done. It's so good.
That's incredible. I've never heard of blue turmeric. Is it actually blue in hue, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, well, it's like blue-gray.
Yeah, it's hard to find foods that are naturally blue, but even if it's got like a hint of blue,
it's less beautiful than gold turmeric, but the flavor is amazing. I'll say that.
Well, Rosie, this has been an absolute delight. I have learned so much. I'm really excited to bust out these chickpeas at my next party. They look absolutely delightful. I'm going to try that WHYY spice blend on my popcorn, maybe tonight. Who knows?
That's a great way to experiment with spices. I should have said that. If you're experimenting with spice blending, have a big bowl of popcorn out. Just make a few different spice blends. It's so much fun.
Real quick though, how do you get the spices to stick to the popcorn? Because mine always falls to the bottom of the bowl.
Butter. You got butter. You melt your butter. You put your spices in the butter, or olive oil is also delicious on popcorn. So is coconut oil, but you got to put it in the fat, and then you toss the popcorn in there and they'll stick.
There we go. That's the ticket. Well, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fun and engaging and super informative. I think I saw someone say that it's educational and entertaining. I like to call it edutaining.
I love that.
Thank you so much for everybody that came out this evening and asked wonderful, insightful questions. And thank you all to the WHYY supporters. None of this would be possible without viewers like you. So everyone, have a great evening and have a festive holiday and spice up your life.
Thanks, Kae Lani. This has been a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming and supporting public media. It's really important, and I am grateful to you.